Good evening, everyone. I'm Jim Blanton, the director of the Louisville Free Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. We have a fantastic author with us this evening, and I just have a few items to share before we get started. First off, a quick housekeeping item. I'd ask that you please turn off your cell phones this evening for the event. And before I introduce our guest, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about some terrific upcoming programs that we have here at the library. October is going to be a very busy month for us. On Saturday, October 8th, we're celebrating Indie Author Day here at Maine. The national event celebrates local authors and offers free workshops to anyone who wants to learn the fundamentals of writing. We also have two FAST classes coming up, Achieving Success in Life with Autism with Dr. Wynn Lawson and Shy and Chit Chat, both in mid-October. And also, we have a new exhibit and several big upcoming programs centering on Shakespeare, all part of Will and the Ville, part of the international commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. If you're interested in author talks, such as tonight's event, we have a number of them coming up at Maine Library in November, including award-winning author Greg Mitchell on November 2nd, and renowned Shakespeare scholar James Shapiro on November 17th in partnership with the University of Louisville and Phi Beta Kappa. If you'd like to learn more about these programs or order tickets, you can visit lfpl.org to learn more information. As many of you know, tonight's program is being offered in partnership with the Filson Historical Society and is part of the library's Craig B. Toe Author Series. The Craig B. Toe Author Series is an endowed program that honors former library director and current Filson director Craig B. Toe, who is with us this evening. We are grateful for the Library Foundation's continued support of author events like this and are thankful to the Filson Historical Society for their ongoing involvement with programming here at the library. Tonight, after the author speaks, we'll open the floor for questions. During the question period, we ask that you think of questions in advance and step up to one of the microphones on either side, and we promise they'll both be working when you do that. It's important that you use them so that everyone attending can hear. And as always, Barnes & Noble will be selling copies of the book after tonight's event, and that's out in the main auditorium there. And we'd like to thank Barnes & Noble for making it possible for the library to host these events. Finally, we will also be giving away a free book as a door prize, which we'll announce at the end of the program. So don't rush out and miss your chance to win. As always, the person who wins the door prize will get the coveted first person in line spot at the author's signing table, which tonight may be a factor, really. Tonight's speaker is a former Newsweek White House correspondent, author, and Louisville native, as you all probably know. Her latest book, Witness Through the Revolution, offers a unique and timely look at a tumultuous period in American history from August 1969 to August 1970. The nation witnessed 9,000 protests and 84 acts of arson or bombings at schools across the country. It was the year of the My Lai massacre investigation, the invasion of Cambodia, Woodstock, and the moratorium to end the Vietnam War. The American death toll in Vietnam was approaching 50,000, and the ascendant counterculture was challenging nearly every aspect of American society. Woven together from original interviews, Witness to the Revolution provides a first-hand account of this turbulent time from those closest to the action, the activists, organizers, radicals, and resistors. Please join me in welcoming Clara Bingham.
Thank you, Jim. Is that working? Great. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I was born in Louisville in 1963, and we'll go back to the year I was born because that's relevant to the book, and lived here for the first 5 years of my life and then came back as much as possible. I worked for the Courier-Journal in the summers after I was 16 years old, and actually David Hopp is right back there, the editor of the Courier at the time, who was my idol and role model in many ways because of the kind of journalism that he believed in and that my family supported for so many years. I also want to give a nod to my cousins, Stephen Riley and Emily Bingham, who are here. So it's an honor to come back home to Louisville and to this library, which my grandmother, Mary Bingham, also dedicated so much passion and time and resources to. We're going to start, before I talk, with a short movie. And it's a clip, just a 4-minute clip, a little promo of the book. And then I'll tell you more about the book.
Good Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to talk to you on a subject of deep concern to all Americans and to many people in all parts of the world, the war in Vietnam. I would like to answer some of the questions that I know are on the minds of many of you listening to me. How and why did America get involved in Vietnam in the first place?
We were like 21, 22, 23 years old. We were kids. We were people who'd come up in activism. We were born in the civil rights movement. We were then born in the anti-war movement. We were born in the women's movement and in the beginning of the queer movement. So all this ferment was happening. And one principle was look to the most oppressed.
The combination of the word black and power shocked the nation. I mean, white people went nuts. You know, they just went nuts.
With the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary, and you're gonna have to keep on saying that.
When Fred Hampton was murdered, even though I was incarcerated at the time, I knew immediately that Fred did not die at the hands of the police officers with the guns who invaded his home. That was set up. And later it was proven that it was set up.
We've got to be out there and not just applauding from the sidelines. But we identified that as being racist, to not take any of the costs.
I was convinced that these guns were not loaded with live ammo. I thought, how ridiculous would that be? Until I saw the ground in front of me churn up, and I realized at that moment that they were live bullets. I was also shot at that point.
The guard all turn in unison and they all shoot in unison. 61 to 67 bullets at unarmed students. My sister was 343 feet away from her shooters.
You had people linking arms and being pepper sprayed or cannoned or beaten for calling for an end to the war. You saw moments and were part of moments where the human spirit was really at its best.
I think it's fair to say that we lost all our political struggles in the 60s. We didn't end capitalism, we didn't end imperialism, we didn't end racism, we didn't actually end the war in Vietnam. However, we did win all the cultural battles. There's no place in the United States you can go today where there's not a women's movement, an environmental movement, alternative health movements. These things are exerting long-term pressures that are deeply and subtly transformative. And it was our assertion then that they were more powerful than politics.
Can anyone hear? I think the audio, here we go. Those voices that you heard were from tape-recorded interviews that I conducted with the people, obviously, in that film, but then with 100 activists from the late 60s. And that's just a snippet. I think it's nice to actually hear their voices, because that's what the book is about. It is really a chorus of stories told in first person. It's an oral history narrative from some people you've heard of, famous activists, and many that you've never heard of. And I wove them together to tell the story of what occurred during the school year of 1969 and 70. And that year I consider to be the crescendo of the 60s. And as Jim told you, there were many cataclysmic, hugely important dramatic, traumatic events that occurred during that time. And I thought that if I focused on this one year and the events of that year, it would be a lens through which to look at the entire decade of the 60s and to try to, through people's own personal experiences, people who were in the streets, doing the work of the peace movement, that we could somehow try to make sense of the 60s, this puzzling decade that changed our country in such a really deep and profound way. I was born in 1963, as I told you earlier, so I missed it. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, because I graduated from college in 1985 in the middle of the Reagan era, and about 12 of us took to the streets to protest apartheid in South Africa, and otherwise everyone was heading off to investment banks for their first jobs. And who knew that only 15 years earlier the largest student strike had taken place in America, and we'd come so close to a civil war. There were over 2 million students who refused to go to class. 700 colleges were shut down, and this was following the Kent State and the Jackson State murders that took place at the time in early May. So here we were 15 years later. I was graduating from college, was able to really do any job of my choosing. As a young woman, my life was completely free, and so many opportunities were available to me. And that was only because of what had occurred in the late 60s. So I embarked on this journey of 3 to 4 years, crossing the country, finding people who could tell me their stories, who were involved in the specific events that took place during that year. And I start the book in August of 1969 with Woodstock, when 500,000 young hippies converged on Max Yasgar's farm in Bethel, New York. They were expecting 100,000. 33 bands played, and one of the musicians who played was Joan Baez, who's pictured right there with her husband, David Harris. And David was in prison at the time, and Joan was pregnant with his child, Gabe. And at Woodstock, she told everybody about why David was in jail. He was the founder of an organization called The Resistance, and he, in many ways, embodied many of the aspects of the peace movement, because he was involved in the civil rights movement, he was involved in the counterculture, and then he became a leader in the anti-war movement. And he was in jail because he resisted being drafted, and he felt that morally that was the best way to try to stop the war. And his movement became quite large. There's Woodstock, amazing. To imagine that sea of humanity. Janis Joplin had a great quote. She said that something like, we used to be just a group of weirdos, and now we realize we're part of a minority. And Abby Hoffman, of course, coined that generation and these people, Woodstock Nation. So I'm going to read from you a little bit from my interview with David Harris, who I met in his house in Marin County. Many of the interviews I conducted took place in Marin County, where so many of the graduates of this movement live. This is what David Harris told me. I considered myself part of the movement from the day I left for Mississippi. What we call the movement, capital T, capital M, was a commitment to justice and the values of democracy. They called us the New Left because it wasn't an ideology. There wasn't a specific politics attached to it. What it was a set of values, finding ways to express themselves. I was in marches, I was in rallies and demonstrations, but there was always a larger question of the conscription system. In that era, when any male turned 18, he had to go to the post office and register for the selective service system. When you registered for selective service, they gave you 2 cards. One was proof that you had registered, and the other indicated your classification. This defined everybody's life. A lot of hippies at the time were looking to get stoned and dance and play. We were all for getting stoned and dancing and playing, but the serious business was how to deal with the machine that's chewing up Southeast Asia. All those things were mingled together, and they were all part of the same uprising of young people who insisted on writing their own ticket, because the tickets that were being written for them were bad at best and criminal at worst. And it wasn't just acid, it was the whole thing. Growing your hair out, wearing clothes that didn't come from JCPenney's or Saks Fifth Avenue. You've got to remember, we grew up in the 50s. The 50s was a time of no options. There was one way to be. When I grew up in Fresno, we had three choices. You could be John Wayne in the sands of Iwo Jima, John Wayne in the sands of Iwo Jima, or John Wayne in the sands of Iwo Jima. That was it. So what happened in the 60s in what is summarized as hippie was making options. There were other ways to be than the one that everyone was insisting we were supposed to be, and we were going to find them. A week after Woodstock, Daniel Ellsberg, who you can see here at age 83 at his house in Berkeley, where I interviewed him, was working for the RAND Corporation. He had previously worked for the LBJ administration in the Defense Department, was a hawk, was very pro-war until he went and worked in Vietnam for 2 years, and once he was down on the ground, realized that the war was unwinnable, and came back from that experience very much on the fence and unsure about how he should conduct his job and his life. And he went to a peace conference, sort of undercover, in Philadelphia a week after Woodstock. And there he heard a young resistance leader, someone who had worked with David Harris, his name was Randy Keeler, describe that he too was about to go to jail, and that he was the last man left in the San Francisco resistance office because everybody was in jail and only women were then working the office. And Randy Keeler started crying as he was telling his story. Everyone in the audience did too. And Ellsberg fled to the bathroom and wept for an hour, and there he had an epiphany. He realized if our best young men, Keeler had gone to Harvard and was at Stanford Stanford Education School, graduate school, if our best young men, if the best thing they could do for the country was to go to jail, then Ellsberg felt that he too should be willing to go to jail to try to stop the war. And that was when he decided to start Xeroxing 7,000 pages of what was later called the Pentagon Papers. And Ellsberg had written one chapter of the papers himself, which documented the history of the war and the many lies that the government had perpetrated over the years since the war began. And this was an act that could be considered treasonous, and he was tried actually for treason later on when he was discovered. But on October 1st, he went in Santa Monica to a strip mall where a friend of his girlfriend owned a real estate office, and he every night would leave Rand with a briefcase full of pages and would spend the evening Xeroxing them. And that was the moment when he switched sides and became part of the movement. My interview with him was just fascinating. It took over 6 hours, and he's still very, very wrapped up in the injustices that were going on at the time and how hard it was to end the war. And he's a very passionate person, and meeting him was very exciting. What Daniel Ellsberg was up against and everyone else in the movement was the FBI. And here we have J. Edgar Hoover, who was head of the FBI for 48 years under 6 presidents. And unbeknownst to everyone in the movement, he had started something called COINTELPRO New Left, which was a counterintelligence program that targeted all of these groups that you see on this list: Black Panthers, civil rights, weathermen, anti-war, GI veterans, down to food co-ops. And the object, he had 2,000 agents who were working undercover for him. This was all off the books, illegal, and no one knew about it. The idea was to discredit, infiltrate, and disrupt and eliminate these groups. One of the groups that the FBI and the Nixon White House were most afraid of were these young, clean-shaven people who ran the Vietnam Moratorium Committee. And they were all part of the Eugene McCarthy campaign in '68. They were clean for Gene. Everyone had shaved their long beards and cut their hair, campaigned for Gene McCarthy in New Hampshire, who had a very strong peace platform. And after McCarthy lost and Nixon won, they committed themselves to trying to end the war. But their goal was they were liberal Democrats. Their goal was to convince middle America, regular Americans, not just hippies and radicals, that the war was wrong and to get them to come out and protest against the war. And they succeeded in October. But before, when they were organizing the war, this man, David Mixner, who should have been in that photo, he was the fourth member of the committee, ran into some problems with the administration. And he told me his chilling story of what happened to him. Here he is in a bar in New York City in Times Square where he lives, and he has a plaque right behind his head that says Mixner's Corner. He still walks with a cane because his knee was broken by a cop during the Chicago Convention police riots in '68. This is what he told me. I was terrified to tell my dad that if I was drafted, I wouldn't serve, which is sort of a joke now because all I had to do was tell them I was gay and I'd have been out instantly. But being in jail for 5 years appealed more to me than letting anyone know that I was gay. It's pretty powerful, isn't it? That's all I had to say. I would rather have gone to jail than have anyone know the truth about me. I wouldn't have been allowed to do anything I was doing. I wouldn't have been a co-chair of the Vietnam Moratorium if I were gay. The movement was still misogynist at the time. Gay? Not a chance. In the world would I be allowed to do any of it. I would have immediately been discarded. One night, I got drunk, went to this really remote, dingy bar, and this vision from God came in, who was exactly my type. Intelligent, handsome, masculine, and we ended up going home together. He said, I know who you are. I work for the federal government. I don't want you to panic. I want to create a safe place for you. I really have feelings for you. He had everything I loved in his house. Tennyson, Neruda, Yeats, all the great poets that I loved, and Elvis Presley and Janis Joplin records. Anyhow, to make a long story short, we started an affair and he did become a very safe place for me. About 30 days into it, he said he had to go away for the weekend. When he got back, he said, let's meet for lunch on Monday. I'll come straight from the airport. I said, great. So I went to the hot shop on K and 16th and sat in a booth waiting for him. 2 guys in suits pulled into the booth and sat across from me and showed me their badges. When someone shows you a badge, how many times have you taken a look at it, especially in those days? I don't know if they were real. They poured out on the table some naked pictures of the 2 of us having sex. It just was as if someone had stuck a knife into my gut. My first thought was, I have to warn Frank. So immediately afterwards, I ran to his apartment to warn him. I used my key to get in, and the place was totally empty. There wasn't a dust ball or anything else in the apartment. I never saw him again. The suits gave me 3 days to get out of the moratorium, or they were going to send these pictures to my family and the press. So I got very drunk and told my friends I had a heart condition and was sick. I decided to kill myself. I bought a gun and put it underneath my mattress and was going to kill myself, but I wanted to get drunk enough to do it. Then I had this moment of clarity and I realized that there was no way they could send the photos to the press. Because how are they going to explain it? Did the government really want the press to know? that they were filming homosexuals and blackmailing them, maybe they had as much to lose as I did. So I sobered up, and when they met up with me 3 days later and asked me, "Are you getting out?" I said, "Send it to them, I don't care," and walked away. Mixner and his compatriots had the best revenge in the end. On October 15th, the largest ever protest against the war took place, the moratorium against the war. 2 million people participated all over the country in sit-ins and teach-ins and rallies, and it proved to the administration that the anti-war movement was a mainstream movement. And the polls at the time, by 1969, more than 50% of America was against the war. This is a rally that took place in the Boston Common. On November 3rd, Nixon gave his silent majority speech, which was a very important speech where he came out against the loud movement and asked Americans to believe him, to stand with him. He knew how to end the war, and that he had this very powerful line where he said, "The North Vietnamese cannot defeat or humiliate the U.S. Only Americans can do that." So he appealed to the patriotic Americans and asked them to trust him, and his approval ratings shot up. And this is Nixon at his desk with thousands of telegrams that came in. Many of them were probably ginned up by his people, but his approval ratings shot up to 68%. So the war at home, the lines were drawn at that stage, and there was a war at home taking place. On November 15th, 1 month after the first moratorium, the second moratorium was conducted, this one just in Washington, D.C., and 500,000 people came. It was the largest ever protest against the war. So the Moratorium Committee was really proving to America that this was no longer a fringe movement. Also in November of '69, the My Lai massacre was revealed. I interviewed the investigative reporter who uncovered this brutal story of an American division, Army division, massacring over 500 citizens who lived in one village in My Lai. Many of them were women and children, toddlers, pregnant women. And Cy Hirsch did more with this story to change the minds of anyone who may have been on the fence about how they felt about Vietnam than any one protest could have done. In December of 1969, Fred Hampton, who was a 21-year-old Black Panther leader, he was very charismatic. He believed in bringing together white progressives and Black progressives, and therefore was that much more threatening because he was an inclusive leader and much loved, was gunned down in his apartment. He was sleeping, and he and Mark Clark, his colleague, were both killed by the Chicago police. His bodyguard, Hampton's bodyguard, was an FBI agent and had slipped him a sleeping pill before he went to sleep, so he was incapable of defending himself. And the Chicago police tried to make it seem as if it were a shootout, but it really wasn't. It was definitely a murder, and it completely radicalized the white movement, who was already on the verge of being radicalized. These are the Weathermen, and I interviewed many of them. They were all part of the Student for Democratic Society, which was the largest anti-war group of students, 100,000 members. And in June of '69, they split up, and the more militant faction, who later called themselves the Weathermen, after a Bob Dylan song, took over. And I interviewed many members of them, Bill Ayers, Bernadine Dorn, Mark Rudd, Brian Flanagan, and many of them were fugitives for all of the '70s. and are fascinating characters. They were all very well educated and many of them from affluent families, but decided to take a very militant, they had a very militant reaction to trying to end the war, which was controversial to say the least. This is what Mark Rudd told me about the impact of Fred Hampton's death on the Weathermen and on the movement. When the Panthers came along and they were carrying guns and spouting by any means necessary, and the government reacted by taking them seriously and murdering them, we said, it's war, and we've got to be out there, not just applauding from the sidelines. See, there's always a tendency for white people to hold back and applaud from the sidelines, but we identified that as being racist, to not take any risks. We didn't want to be liberals. To be a liberal was to be a hypocrite, to be a betrayer. So part of our thinking was, which side are you on? Avenge Fred Hampton became our battle cry. Black power had become an enormous challenge to white kids. Would we be good Germans? Would we be racist and ignore what's happening? Or would we support the people who are fighting and taking the risks? That became the challenge for the Weathermen. Most young whites don't understand the extent of the challenge and that the black movement posed to the Weather Underground and to the movement. I also interviewed Julius Lester, who was part of an African-American man, part of SNCC, who was not a Panther, and this is what he told me about Fred Hampton's death. It's very interesting the different reactions of whites and those of us who were in SNCC had to the murder of Fred Hampton. Our feeling at SNCC was that the rhetoric of the Panthers led to his death. The Panthers had this rhetoric of violence, and if it's one thing that white America knows, it's violence. You don't challenge somebody on their strength, so you don't get violent with white America because they're itching to kill you. Our feeling was that Fred Hampton did not have to die. That was the Panthers' doing. So our response was very different from the response of SDS. The other deaths of the Panthers were senseless as far as we were concerned. You don't challenge white policemen with guns. They're eager to kill you. And in fact, in 1969, 27 Panthers were killed. 700 of them were jailed. And there were many trials that took place. In February of 1970, the Panther 21 trial began in New York City. 21 Panthers in the New York office were rounded up and incarcerated in jails all over the city with $100,000 bail money, which was considered completely inappropriate and very hard for them to organize and get defense. And so the rallying cry of Free the Panther 21 became one of the mottos of the movement. And that trial was one of the first times that the Weathermen started bombing. They bombed the house of Judge Murtagh, who was the judge for the Panther 21 trial. I interviewed Judge Murtagh's son, who was in the house at the time. It was a firebomb that it destroyed property but did not kill anybody. And some of the more militant members of the Weather Underground were very disappointed that their bomb was not successful. On March 6th, a group of weathermen were building a bomb in the basement of a townhouse on West 11th Street in the Village. The townhouse belonged to Kathy Wilkerson's father, who was a prominent businessman who'd gone on vacation, and Kathy asked him if she could stay in his house for a week. The bomb that was being built in the basement exploded accidentally and killed 3 young members of the Weathermen. And the shocking thing, among many shocking things, is what the bomb was intended to do. They intended to detonate it at Fort Dix at an officers' dance. And if it had, in fact, detonated there, it would have killed officers, their dates, the band members, waiters, all sorts of innocent people would have died. So the Weathermen eventually realized that this was a fortunate accident and they changed their strategy to bombing light after this occurred. They also a few hundred of them went underground and led the life of fugitives, many of them for an entire decade. And they were joined by a large group of other people who were underground, avoiding the draft, avoiding drug laws, many people were being arrested on petty charges for protests. And so there was a huge community of people underground by 1970. On May 1st, Nixon announced that America was invading Cambodia with troops on the ground. He had been bombing Cambodia for a year secretly, and May 1st was the first that the public heard of a now next level of bringing troops into Cambodia. The entire country, especially students, reacted very strongly. There were protests everywhere. And at Kent State, which was a conservative state university in Ohio, 4 students were killed, 13 total were shot by the Ohio National Guard. I interviewed 8 people who were there that day, that fateful day, 2 of whom had been shot. This is Dean Kaler, who was paralyzed for the rest of his life after that day. And one person I interviewed lives here in Louisville, Ben Post, who was the former editor of the Courier-Journal. And he was a journalism student at Kent State. And he witnessed and wrote about this for the local paper. And I found with Ben, as with everyone else I interviewed, they didn't forget a moment. They could recount every single hour of what happened during that day. Ben's revelation that he still is haunted by is he saw at night, the night before May 4th, on May 3rd, a National Guardsman loading his rifle with live ammunition. And he thought, well, I wonder what he's using real bullets for. And then never wrote about it. And then after the killing, he was very upset that he didn't realize that that was such a big story, that they were using live ammunition, because no one thought that they were using live ammunition at the time. I also interviewed John Filo, the photographer who took this photograph of Marianne Vecchio leaning over the body of Jeffrey Miller. And he also was a journalism student at the time and was completely still traumatized by what he witnessed, and also by the journalistic question of, do you photograph or do you help? What is your role as a journalist in an event like this? But one of the things that surprised me the most is Dean Kaler told me that when he was in the hospital fighting for his life, which was weeks and weeks of critical care, he received hate mail. And people wrote him letters saying, I wish that the National Guard had had better aim and that you had died. And his family received hate mail. So did John Filo. And it was really that surprised me and helped me understand how polarized the country was at that point. I also interviewed a policeman, detective who worked at Madison, Wisconsin, at the university there, which was one of the most violent universities in the country. The National Guard was in Madison for 2 years straight. And Tom McCarthy told me that after Kent State, he walked around Madison and taunted the students by raising one hand with 4 fingers and another with 0, saying, we got 4, you got 0. So that gives you a sense of the war at home that was taking place at this time. After Kent State and then Jackson State, which was on the 12th of May when 2 black students were killed by the National Guard, schools shut down all over the country. And this is a moment when many people believed that we were as close to a civil war as we had been since the 1860s. And this is Yale, and on May in early May. And at the same time at Yale, there was a Panther trial going on. It was the New Haven Nine. So that had also brought a lot of students there to protest. One of the ways people reacted to the violence and to Kent State was, and to so many of the events that were going on at that time, was to go back to the land. There were about 3 million people living in communes by 1970, and at the same time as well, the feminist movement was in full revival. This is Peter Coyote. He started 2 communes in California. He was also part of a group called the Diggers, who were in Haight-Ashbury in the late 60s, and were one of the early hippie communal organizations. He later became a pretty well-known actor, and I interviewed him in Marin County. This is what he told me. I've always suspected that the environmental movement was engendered in some way by the shootings at Kent State. When people saw that the culture was willing to shoot their own children to keep the war machine going, I think a lot of people moved their energy into the environment where they could see it as a future struggle, but it didn't engender police resistance in getting shot and killed. We had already left confrontational politics. By that time, we were deep into cultural warfare. So we saw the news of the Kent and Jackson State shootings as the fulfillment of predictions that we had made. The Diggers were cultural revolutionaries. We began to analyze the situation more deeply and realize that the entire culture was producing the Vietnam War. This wasn't a political aberration. If you accepted the premises of profit and private property, you wound up in Vietnam. I have a chapter on the second wave feminist movement, Women's Lib, and interviews with fascinating women who were all part of the civil rights and the anti-war movement, but were disillusioned by how sexist all of their male colleagues were. And by 1970, many of them had split off and started their own movement. And this was a major women's strike for peace that occurred in August of 1970. This was the king of the counterculture, Timothy Leary. For many years in the 60s, the counterculture and the anti-war New Left operated on slightly different tracks and parallel tracks, and they were suspicious of each other in many ways. But by 1970, that had changed, and that's why we had a perfect storm of rebellion. The Black Power movement, the counterculture, and the anti-war movement came together, and in a way, Tim Leary symbolized part of this combustive explosion of rebellion. He was jailed for 10 years for possession of 3 marijuana cigarettes in a low security prison in San Luis Obispo, California. And in early September, the Weather Underground helped him escape. And it was a hijinks escape. He was, at this stage, about 50 years old and had to climb over a very high wall and then shimmied down a telephone wire. And they helped him get to Algiers, where he lived with Eldridge Cleaver, who was also there, Black Panther, who was there. And I interviewed several people who were involved in this escape. Which was quite a hijinks caper, but also important symbolically. And I'm going to read you the communique that Bernadine Dorn, who was the main spokeswoman for the Weather Underground, released after Timothy Leary's escape. It gives you a sense of the rhetoric and the passion of the time. The Weatherman Underground has had the honor and pleasure of helping Dr. Timothy Leary escape from the POW camp in San Luis Obispo, California. Dr. Leary was being held against his will and against the will of millions of kids in this country. He was a political prisoner, captured for the work he did in helping all of us begin the task of creating a new culture on the barren wasteland that has been imposed on this country by Democrats, Republicans, capitalists, and creeps. LSD and grass, like the herbs and cactus and mushrooms of the American Indians and countless civilizations that have existed on this planet, will help us make a future world where it will be possible to live in peace. Now we are at war. Our organization commits itself to the task of freeing these prisoners of war. We are outlaws. We are free. So I end the book with Leary's escape. And I have an afterword that tells my readers that on 1973, after being actually a fugitive for a while, arrested, he was a fugitive, was arrested, and then went to trial for treason. Daniel Ellsberg, his case was dismissed because of government misconduct and illegal evidence gathering by the FBI and the plumbers. So that was a moment of victory for the movement. And it also was an example of how the Nixon and Hoover, in their quest to destroy the movement, ended up ultimately destroying themselves. And what happened with Ellsberg and everyone else was just a precursor, really, to Watergate. And the plumbers were the people who went after Ellsberg and raided his psychiatrist's office. And stories that we all know now. I talked to many of the people that I interviewed about what they really feel the legacy of the 60s and the movement is. And one of the more thoughtful people I talked to was Mark Rudd of the Weathermen. He was very contrite and apologetic. He felt that the Weather had made many mistakes. They had been successful. They had 38 bombings that the FBI never solved, not one. And also, the FBI was on one of the largest manhunts in history, trying to find these fugitives who are all living underground in many different parts of the country, working menial jobs, having children, having families. Mark Rudd was one of them. But what Rudd thinks now is that their militancy, that the bombing that they did, alienated many middle Americans, and that in fact the Weathermen did more to help Nixon than they did to help the movement. This is what he told me. I think the hippies have gotten no credit for having accomplished a lot. In fact, you say the word hippie and people laugh. It's like hippie and train wreck are somehow related. But actually, the new left was a train wreck because we lost bad. In essence, the new left forgot power, or we thought the power was going to fall into place somehow automatically. We thought the liberals would take power and we would be to the left of them, but that's not what happened. What happened was a far-right reaction took place, the right-wing reaction, both within the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party, moved everything to the right. It was a closing of the New Deal chapter, and those of us who were self-consciously political, we were the tail end of the entire socialist movement of 100 and more years. Now, there's no more socialism. Of course, he told me that before Bernie ran for president. But I'd like to conclude with that Mark Rudd quote, and I hope you all might have some questions, but even more than questions, if you have any stories of your own to tell from that, if you were involved in the movement, or even especially during this particular year, I think we'd all love to hear your stories, and please go to the microphone. Thank you.
Test.
Yes, hi.
I feel like I was there, being born in '54. I was 10 in 64. 68, I was 14. When I got to Western Kentucky University, I was 17 in 1972. It was on. And I remember growing up listening to Walter Cronkite and who were the other two together? Huntley Brinkley. I don't know who was on ABC. I have just two quick questions. Do you know anything about Agnew?
Sure.
And have you ever tried medical or baked goods or
Sorry,
brownies?
I advise everyone against brownies. They're very dangerous. No, Agnew, Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, was used very much as a spokesman to attack the movement. And William Safire wrote his speeches, and he used very pugnacious and aggressive language to try to belittle the movement. And he was pretty effective. Thank you.
Thank you for what you've done today. Appreciate it. I've got two questions. They're about you. But first of all, yeah, I did go to Canada. I did smoke. So I'd like to know, first of all, you say you were born in '63 and that you're from the area? The first part of my question is, how well did your folks protect you from this awareness, since it's become your life, a big focus of your life? And then secondly, what do you think about what in the world happened last night on TV?
I lived in Louisville for the first 5 years of my life, from '63 to '68, and my father died in '66, and my mother moved us, to my brother and I, to New York City. So in 1968, we moved into an apartment on the Upper West Side on Central Park West, and I was only 5, but then for the next, chunk of years, my playground was Central Park, and it was also the staging ground for the movement. So it was a really interesting place from which to witness what was going on in so many different parts of the movement. And so I was just oblivious to some degree, but it was also the wallpaper of my life. It's one of the reasons why I became so curious about what was really going on when I was too young to participate. And my hometown heroines then were Bella Abzug, who was a very funny congresswoman from Manhattan, and she was very anti-war, and she was a great women's liber, and also Shirley Chisholm, who was a congresswoman from Harlem. She ran for president in 1972, and I had photographs of them all over my room. And so my mother was a McCarthy delegate in the '68 convention. And also my Aunt Eleanor, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight because she's out of town. I call her in my acknowledgments the godmother of the book, because she was one of the great hippies back then. She was the videographer for the Grateful Dead. And among many other interesting jobs that she had as a documentary filmmaker at the time. And so I always looked up to her, and that was another reason why I was so interested. And last night I thought Hillary crushed it. Thank you.
Regarding the underground, you mentioned Mark Rudd, but did you get a chance to interview either Bill Ayers or Bernadette Doran?
Yes, I did.
Bernadette Doran?
Yes, I interviewed her twice, and she's married to Bill Ayers, and Bill Ayers, of course, became famous when Obama first ran for president, because they were on the same board of a community organization in Chicago, and Bill Ayers is still very outspoken and unapologetic. Both he and Bernadette Doran have a different take on what they did than Mark Rudd does, and they were both spinning me. I'd go and meet with them, and then I'd meet with Mark Rudd, and they were definitely at odds about their legacy. But Bill Ayers had an interesting quote. He said, "I'll apologize when Henry Kissinger apologizes." So he said, he killed 3 million Vietnamese. I didn't kill anybody. So get me on a stage with him and we'll have some truth and reconciliation, and that's when I'll apologize for all the mistakes I made. So, and he's a longtime professor of education. He's published over 10 books on education, and Bernadine Dorn for a long time ran a children's legal services center at Northwestern Law School.
She's still at Northwestern?
No, I think she's retired. But when I interviewed her, I went to her offices at Northwestern Law School.
Was she pretty forthcoming during the interview?
She actually found her frustratingly cagey. I wanted so much more from all the weathermen were very, unsure. One funny one, Brian Flanagan, said, "I just don't like talking about my felonies. I know." I know that the statute of limitations is up, but it still makes me uncomfortable. So there's still a lot we don't know, and I did my best to squeeze out as much as Bernadine and Bill and the others would tell me.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question.
First off, thank you so much for being here. It's really great to hear somebody talk so knowledgeably about people I've read so much about. But my question, I have a pair of questions. One ties in with what you were talking about. Seems like Ayers and Dorn and Rudd, they're all more or less public intellectuals, academics, things like that. And did any of them spend any time in prison, or was it
No. Bernadine did for a few months after they came out of hiding in 1980 because she refused to rat on another weatherman who was still underground, and so she served a few months, and which was hard. She had very young children at the time. But the amazing thing is, and I interviewed I didn't quote him, but one of my most interesting interviews was with an FBI agent named Bill Dyson. I went and saw him. He was retired in Florida, and he was the case agent for the weathermen. So he spent about 8 years overhearing all of their conversations and knew more about them than almost anybody else, and was fascinated by them, and also frustrated because they couldn't catch them. They tried and tried and were not able to. Of course, now in the digital age, there's no way anyone could be a fugitive for that long, although there is still one fugitive I still know of named Leo Burt, who was not part of the Weather Underground, but he was part of the New Year's gang, 4 men who were at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, who bombed a building that I write about in August 24th of 1970, and accidentally killed someone. And 3 of they all became fugitives, and 3 were discovered, found, and did time in jail. But Leo Burt has still never been found.
I had one other question. It was related to Ellsberg. When Edward Snowden made his disclosures about the NSA in 2013, I mean, his name was the first one that popped up in my mind, because I think what Snowden did was at its core an act of disobedience, kind of akin to what Ellsberg did. I'm not sure when you interviewed him, but if it happened after what Snowden had disclosed, what were his thoughts on him? What did he have to say about it?
He's been very outspoken about Snowden, I think, publicly, but he talked to me about it a lot. And he is very supportive of Snowden and feels that what Snowden did was a patriotic act. And he said that what Snowden did was much more courageous than what he did, because Snowden released current information that was very damning and to the public trust, essentially. But what Ellsberg was releasing was old information that wasn't really particularly relevant to what Nixon was doing at the time. It was historical, and he said, if I'd had better stuff, I would have released it, but I didn't. And I think he's been in touch with Snowden and very involved in the whole Snowden defense process, or at least as a sort of public figure. Thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. You thought about doing a documentary on this?
I thought about it when I'd done produced a documentary before I wrote this book, and so I was in documentary mode, which is one of the reasons why I wrote this as an oral history narrative, because I thought that the first person voices were so powerful. So I had to make a decision when I went to interview everybody, would I film those interviews? And I was really torn about it because I knew that these were historic figures and that not all of them were going to be around, and I wouldn't be able to go back and retrieve a lot of what they had told me if I decided later to do a documentary. In fact, 6 of the people I interviewed have since died, but I didn't. I decided not to film it, and the reason why is I wanted to have very long, intimate interviews. And with some people, I had interviews that were just on Skype, but that lasted for multiple days. And it was the sort of thing where if you wanted to actually film all of it, it would have been just a different kind of a project. And also, whenever you turn up with a film crew to someone's house, it's just not the same. And it's hard to get them to really talk to you on the same level of intimacy unless you're spending lots and lots of time with them, which many filmmakers do. But I just decided what I did was I taped everything on broadcast quality audio. And one of the things I would like to do is try to make a radio documentary. Based on their voices. And that's something that I'm sort of working on, but not actively. I mean, I'm hoping I can find a way to do that, especially because audio is, and podcasts are becoming such an important part of people's lives right now. And the voices are very, moving and immediate.
Now, you said you had some extensive talks with Ayers and Dorn and Rudd. Now, did they, in your conversations, speak about any of the parallels between that time and today? And what were some of their thoughts about that?
Well, I interviewed everybody before the election. So it would be interesting for me to go back to them because none of them would have predicted the Bernie movement. None of them. And as Mark Rudd said, there is no more socialism in America. I think that it's, so I didn't talk to them that much at the time. They were disillusioned by how millennials were not that active. And Black Lives Matter was just happening. That movement was just beginning. Move On and Occupy had occurred. So there were glimmers, they thought, of activism in the younger generation. Their generation was called the awakened generation. And I think that's a really amazing term because they were so alive and awake and active, and that is partly because of the draft and the war. And that's why it's so hard to compare what then to now. 27 million men were eligible for the draft between 1965 and 1973, and that'll certainly wake you up and make you go out and vote. And although, let's not forget, Nixon won in a landslide in 1972. But they were sorry that there was such a huge divide, for example, between rich and poor, and that poverty and racism and police brutality was still taking place. But what I didn't get to talk to them about was what happened when a socialist who was a hippie who went up to Vermont in 1967 with the whole pilgrimage of people who wanted to live alternative lifestyles, Bernie Sanders actually ran for president. And I'm sure they would all have been quite surprised by the fact that he garnered 13 million votes.
I appreciated hearing the outrage that whites felt about Fred Hampton. I don't know that I've ever heard that anywhere. So thank you for that. And I wanted to know, given your background, how this research has affected you, number one, and what parallels do you make between that period and now? Because where that generation called themselves awakened, this generation is using the word woke. I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't know that.
So some people are saying, I'm woke. So, yeah.
That's great.
So if you
That's great. Well, I feel the parallels are, I feel that there's a lot of the unfinished business of the 60s is bubbling up right now. And That is why we're seeing what we're seeing in the inner city with the police brutality and people protesting and Black Lives Matter. That is very much unfinished business. That one thing Julius Lester told me is, well, the civil rights movement might have been successful and we did get the right to vote and segregation ended, but there was one thing we couldn't end, which is racism. And I feel like that's what we're still dealing with now. That the laws may have changed, and of course we have the whole criminal justice nightmare. But generally the laws have changed, but attitudes haven't changed yet. And it's ending racism that is really what needs to happen next. And I feel like that's the sort of last throes of what these people were trying to do in the 60s. And as for me, I don't know if it's changed me. I just was completely inspired by everybody I met, many of them, and by how passionate they were about trying to make America a better place. And it made me want to try to stick to my goals of doing what I can in the way that I can do it, to reveal and write about and be involved in making America great again. Yes.
Hi, I just shortly you asked for stories, and I thought it was sort of odd sitting listening to the history that I lived in. So I thought I'm seeing a lot of heads nod. I was at IU and I was a junior that year, and we were going to have our big march, and everybody had been protesting, and I remember it was exam week, and I got up and talked to the students, and we all walked out of the exam. And that was the day that the university shut down. So it was really hot. Everybody was going out the next day. We knew we were going to have a major march. We had the first Black student government president at IU. That set a whole other stage of tension going on because the Ku Klux Klan was very active around there. So at the same time that we were going out very passionately objecting to the Vietnam War and everything that had been going on with that, there was also the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses on the hillside. There were townspeople who didn't like the students and were going out beating up on side streets with chains. And there was a National Guard flying overhead. So if you can imagine, there are 30,000 of us marching and shouting, and there were helicopters going overhead, there were people screaming, there were fire engines, there were police. It was an extraordinary moment that I will never forget in my life. And you hear it in history, it doesn't capture what that moment is that I'll never forget. And I always felt that time period was so incredible because so much changed, and there became so much, all of society changed at that point, and it was really an extraordinary and liberating time to live. I'm lucky I was there.
You sure are lucky. I'm jealous. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. This is our last question.
Okay, how about that? I hope I'm not one-upping her, but I was one of those conservative students at Kent State when that happened. And I can tell you, it was a very radicalizing time for me. It was like a 180 turn for me. What you said about Dean Kaler and the hate mail that he got, many of us went home to conservative families and got no comfort there because of what happened and how our politics changed.
How did it radicalize you?
It turned me into a liberal, basically. Yeah. So much as society's changed so much since then. All the civil rights movements and the liberation movements, and it's been quite a ride to just living through these decades. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's amazing that you were there. That really is amazing. Well, thank you. I'm going to go back and sign books for anybody who wants them. Thank you for having me.
This has been a Metro TV production.